The Yoga Sutras of Pantanjali, Book 1, Sutra 5, a commentary by Dr. Lisa Love, utilizing the commentaries found in the following 3 books: Light on the Yoga Sutras of Pantanjali by B.K.S. Iyengar, the Yoga Sutras of Pantanjali by Sri Swami Satchidananda, and The Light of the Soul, which is a commentary in the Yoga Sutras of Pantanjali by Alice A. Bailey. So a simple interpretation is that, to summarize the previous sutras 1 through 4 that we've looked at in Book 1, they all relate how yoga is about self-realization. Now this sutra begins to share how that self-realization of who we really are as the self, which Alice Bailey calls the Christ consciousness, it can also be called your Buddha nature, etc., that self-realization can be blocked. And it is blocked primarily through 5 mind states that cause us to forget the self we are. We are also told that these 5 mind states may be painful or painless. They cause pain or don't cause pain. By learning to work with these mind states in a healthy way, we remain poised or unattached from the painful or painless responses these mind modifications can produce. So let's start with the commentary by Sri Swami Satchidananda, and he interprets the Sanskrit as there are 5 kinds of mental modifications which are either painful or painless. So he starts with this interesting statement that even pleasurable thought might ultimately bring us pain. How interesting. Reflect on that for a moment. That at times things that we think are going to be pleasurable, don't they also at times end up causing us pain? Contemplate for a few moments in your own life on that. Sri Swami Satchidananda also suggests that the words selfish and selfless might be better replacements for painful or painless. So again, you might say that there are 5 kinds of mental modifications which are either selfish or selfless, if we follow what he's saying. So after he gives examples of negative and selfish thoughts, he goes on in his commentary to indicate that when we think we would do better, to cultivate selfless and positive thoughts instead. So, and again, I encourage you to read the commentary in these books. I am doing a massive summary of what is said in any of these books, and Sri Swami Satchidananda especially has such wonderful stories that he shares in his book and in his sutras and his commentaries on the sutras. So it's just really interesting that we as the self can start to master our thoughts, and they can be selfless or painless or painful or selfish, depending on how we are directing and choosing them. And the more we become the self, the peaceful self, the more we can choose those thoughts. So let's look at a practical example. Let's look at the loss of a relationship. Now that can be very difficult for a lot of people. It's a traumatic experience and very hard to remember who we are as the self when we're going through such a difficult thing. So it's easy to forget. And let's not judge ourselves if we forget. This isn't a practice about learning how to be 100% perfect all the time as the peaceful self. It's a practice, that's why I call it the peaceful self process. It's a process of continually learning to remember who we really are as the self, so we can work with mental states, in this example, in a selfless way. So, some thoughts that may arise at the loss of a relationship may include, I will never survive this. And emotionally, we may feel despair. We may even feel hate for the fact that the person has died, or we've lost this relationship, or that we're going through this difficult experience. And if this mental and emotional difficulties continue, it can result even in a physical illness of some kind. So how do we work with this in a more healthy way that doesn't cause us so much pain? Do you see the mental, emotional, and physical pain that's happening here? Because we've become blocked from the self, we no longer remember that that's who we really are. How can we have it work differently? Well, here's a way. If we remember that we are the self, we can practice something that I borrowed from the Buddhist Nobel Peace Prize winner, Thich Nhat Hanh. Heart breaks open. We can understand that when we have a heartbreak, it's opening us up to that tender, sensitive spot within ourselves, that tender, sensitive spot that exists within others whenever there's a heartbreak. That heartbreak can open us up to remembering the love for ourselves that we need to access from the self that we are, and the love that we can have for others who have experienced similar difficulties. Mentally, we can tell ourselves, despite this loss, I am still worthy of love. Emotionally, we can say, I have compassion for my pain. You learn to sit with that emotion in a compassionate way. You're not denying it. You're just sitting with it. And physically, we can take the time that we need to rest and to repair, because we're appreciating that we are going through a difficult time. And instead of trying to ignore that, we sit with it. We are mindful, we are compassionate, and we are taking the time to nurture ourselves at a vital and physical level. That's the beauty of crossing that rainbow bridge, that Antakarana, getting that bridge strong and stable so we don't forget that we remember who we are as the self, so that our thoughts are selfless for ourselves individually as well as for others, and it no longer causes us the same level of pain. All right, now that we're done with the practical example, let's go back to the commentary by B.K.S. Iyengar and how he interprets the Sanskrit. He says the movements of consciousness are fivefold. They may be cognizable or non-cognizable, painful or non-painful. Here's his key thoughts. Here's a quote from him. These modifications, of which there are 5, are explained in the next sutra. That's going to be Sutra 6. We're actually, in the sutras that come up, we're going to go through each and every one of these 5 states in detail. But for now, we just know that there are 5, and they may be visible or hidden, painful or not, distressing or pleasing, cognizable or non-cognizable. Another quote from him, thoughts, when associated with anguish, are known as painful, klista conditions of the mind and consciousness. When something is incognizable, it is in an aklista state, such as a live coal covered with ash. He indicates that everything that has pleasure, such as sex, has pain within it, childbirth, and vice versa. And he says that even spiritual, non-painful, blissful states can have danger, because when they fade away, they can produce attachment. So where you don't see quotes here, this is me summarizing what he is saying in his commentary on this sutra. And again, please read the commentary for yourself and get the books. So in other words, we're becoming aware that everything that happens to us in life has both pain and pleasure mixed within it. It reminds me of a wonderful poem, you can look it up on the internet, by Khalil Gibran, called Joy and Sorrow. That everything has joy and sorrow within it. And when you learn to understand that, you can reside within the self more. I remember reading that poem by Khalil Gibran when I was a teenager and really struck by it. So we approach life knowing that whenever we're really excited and happy about something, it doesn't mean that we're all gloom and doom, oh, now what's the bad thing that's going to happen? It's just, instead we learn, oh, enjoy this moment. This is a joyful moment, without getting too attached, like I should always have joyful moments. And whenever we have a painful moment, instead of becoming absorbed in it like, oh my God, life is pain, that's a modification of the mind right there. Life is pain. It's always going to be pain. Instead, we say, this is just a moment of pain. And within that moment, you can sit, you can become mindful, and you can recognize that there may be a teaching in that moment of pain, which then brings pleasure. In a pleasurable moment, like he says, you may have sex, it's wonderful, but it may bring childbirth, which is painful, but each has within it the seeds of joy and sorrow. This is a tricky thing, especially in the West, for us to understand, especially those of us that have been through certain kinds of spiritual teachings that try to imply that we should be happy all the time, that life is meant to be happy, and if it's not, something is wrong. Now, in Alice Bailey's teaching, she talks about the difference between joy and happiness. Joy is the state when we're abiding in the self. Happiness is when we're stuck on something that is transitory, and that's what these Yoga Sutras are talking about. So they may be cognizable or incognizable. Incognizable is when you don't recognize what it really is. Like you think it's just a pile of ash, but within it is a hot coal. Like you think it's just a snake, but it turns out it's a poisonous snake that has a bite. So sometimes we cognize, we understand it, and sometimes we don't understand what it really is that we're dealing with. So let's look again at our levels of consciousness, and we are going to start to get an understanding of these different mental states as they reflect themselves in the emotional and physical as well. So we have the self or selfless levels, Atmic or Buddhic. We have the ego or selfish levels, which are Klista, if we understand the visible cause, and Aklista, if we don't understand the cause, it's invisible. Klista, if it's cognizable. Aklista, if it's not cognizable. And so let's take a look at some of these. So mental states that can cause difficulty is a lack of clear seeing, which can be a distortion. It's non-cognizable. We don't see it clearly. A classic example is you see a rope and you assume that it's a snake, but it's not. It's just a rope. When you turn the lights on, you understand that's what it is. That example is actually used in the commentaries by Sri Swami Satchidananda. And Alice Bailey calls this lack of clear seeing illusion in her books. So mentally, we can have illusion, distortion, lack of clear seeing. Emotionally, we can have fancy, which when we get into identifying these 5 mental states, one of them is called fancy, which is really more of an emotional reaction. It's not so much mind as emotional mind, or kama, emotional mind, manas, kama manas. And Alice Bailey calls these particular problems glamour. In fact, she has a whole book where there's far more than 5 of these. There's like maybe a few hundred of these glamours that she says that we have to learn to deal with and overcome. Then on the physical level, and when we get into the 5 different mental states as listed in the Yoga Sutras, sleep and memory are going to be a couple of them, but they're really more related to what happens physically when we become devitalized. So these are some more details of the different states we'll be looking at with a lot more detail as we move on to Sutra 6 and beyond. So going back to B.K.S. Iyengar in his commentary, he says, cognizable, remember we understand them, cognizable pains and anguishes are controlled or annihilated by the practice of yoga and by willpower. Incognizable pains are prevented from rising to the state of cognition by freedom from desires and by non-attachment. And then he says, in painful states, the non-pains may be hidden, and consequently the virtues are difficult to recognize or perceive. So if we understand what we're dealing with, we can simply use yoga and willpower to help us remember who we really are as self and work with it effectively, mentally, emotionally, and physically. But if we don't fully understand what we're dealing with, we can learn to see what it is by freeing ourselves from desires and non-attachment. I'll give an example. I recently was working with an individual who had some personality traits that were difficult to deal with, but I didn't understand that. They were incognizable, non-cognizable, right away when I encountered the person. So I did not understand them. And as I began to see this person's personality difficulties and reactions, I really did have to work with becoming non-attached, so I didn't get into the emotional upset. I have to confess, I got a little bit into it. But remembering who I am as the self, I kept working to, as I saw what it was, to remain free from an attachment to the outcome, and instead tried to learn skillful means, to use a Buddhist term, to work with this person in a more effective way. Sometimes the virtues are difficult to recognize or perceive. Sometimes we go through what may be in outer appearance a very difficult circumstance and discover that there were wonderful benefits in the end. I saw a Buddhist monk who gave a wonderful, actually it was a Buddhist Lama, who gave a wonderful talk. And he said, in the West, people want to win the lottery by winning millions of dollars. But in his tradition, you win the lottery by attracting to yourself really difficult people, because then it gives you a chance to practice your yoga or your mindfulness or your spiritual practice, whatever it is. So here we have our levels of consciousness again, and the ways to prevent pain are to stay anchored in the self. That comes about through union or yoga. And as we do that, we develop mental willpower, emotional freedom from desires, and physical detachment. Now, when we say emotional freedom from desires, it doesn't mean that we don't have desires. It means that we're not attached to whether they are fulfilled or not. We have more of an allowing that happens with it. We're enjoying the journey or the ride instead of focusing on the outcome. Again, there's that rainbow bridge, that antakarana, that we want to have remain stable so that we are able to have that mental willpower, emotional freedom from desires, and physical detachment no matter what. So here are some examples I'm going to give to you of how we deal with pleasure and pain. So we get a new relationship. We're all excited. It's infatuation. It's the thrill of romance. It feels like the wonderful everything. And if we get all caught up in that and don't remember that all relationships have cycles, we will experience possibly the pain of potential loss. So that person may come or may go. That person may stay and may do things that irritate us or that disappoint us. And so we may lose some of our thrill of romance. We may buy a new home and we're all excited about a new place to live and the investment that we're going to make in it. And yet we also may have payments, mortgage payments, rent if we're not buying a new home, taxes that we have to pay in association with it. We may win the lottery. Now we have plenty of money. But we may also take on a full-time role as a money manager. My PhD dissertation was on wealth and spirituality, and one of the reasons so many lottery winners lose all the money is they don't know how to handle it. They don't know how to control their desire nature, so they spend it too quickly, or they get really disappointed because now they're a full-time philanthropist trying to figure out how to deal with money, and in some ways they may feel less free as when they had the more simple lifestyle and didn't have this responsibility of administrating all this money and dealing with all the people who were wanting a piece of it. We become pregnant. We have the joy of a new life and the pain of pregnancy and the long-term expenses that may go with a child as we raise him or her. So here you start to get the sense that if you can learn to ride easy in the saddle, so to speak, with pleasure or pain, then you're not sucked into either one. It's not the same roller coaster ride that you're on of highs and lows. Instead, it's just kind of a watching, that observer. You're watching whether pleasure or pain, seeming pleasure or pain, I should say, come into your life. Here's some more examples. We start with something that seems painful, like an illness, causes suffering and even potential death. Seems pretty bad. But the pleasure, as many people know who have had an illness, may be that there's a great growth, spiritual growth that happens. And especially with people that have near-death experiences, etc., they may lose their fear of death. Or if you reconcile yourself in an illness, whether you die or not, I've known some people who have passed on, you may end up losing your fear of death and have a wonderful opportunity to come to peace, the peaceful self, at the end of your life. Job loss, a lot of anxiety, financial insecurity is part of the pain. But also the pleasure is the potential to shift to a new kind of work. Maybe that loss of the job propels you into starting a business or into doing something you really loved and you were afraid to do. It can be full of wonderful opportunities. Maybe you move to a new town or even a new country. Maybe you take up new skills. We already dealt with relationship loss, grief, and feelings of abandonment, rejection can become appreciation and strengthening your ability to relate in healthy ways. You may learn to love yourself a lot more after that relationship loss, become much more discerning of the right kind of partner for you, and become much healthier and attract healthier people to you. War, another really awful, painful example, a lot of devastation and loss, can also bring about insight as to the necessity for peace. So are you getting this sense of these Yoga Sutras? This is so key. Pain and pleasure, pleasure and pain, joy and sorrow, sorrow and joy, they always arise together. And how can you sit easily with either? Let's now look at the commentary by Alice Bailey. The mind states are 5 and are subject to pleasure or pain. They are painful or not painful. So what she says is, what is subject to reacting to pleasure or pain? Alice Bailey lets us know it is the lower psychic or emotional nature, which is the area of kama, manas, or desire mind in human beings. So she attributes it mainly to that level. Not just mind, but emotional mind, kama, manas, desire mind. And she says, quote, these impulses should be replaced by the considered intelligent action of the soul or spiritual man whose nature is love, whose acts are wise, occultly understood, and whose motive is group development. Therefore, that reaction called pain must be transcended, and likewise that term pleasure, for both of these are dependent upon identification with the form. Non-attachment must supersede them. So, first of all, just some general thoughts. Alice Bailey wrote at a time in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, 1910s, long before we were sensitive to he, she. So the male pronoun was what everybody did at that time in world history, and that's why she uses it in her book. But spiritual man can mean man, woman. Also, the word occult simply means occlude or hidden. So when she says that these impulses should be replaced by the considered intelligent action of the soul or spiritual man whose nature is love, and then she says the acts are wise, occultly understood. That means wise from the hidden realms, the realm of the soul. It's the soul that we are, the peaceful self that we are, who is wise, who is loving, and whose motive is group development, always to learn how to get along with the group that you are in terms of your thoughts. That's a group of thoughts, your feelings, group of feelings, all the different parts of your body is a group. You get along with that group. You get along with other groups through love and wisdom. And as you learn to do that, you're not attached to pain or pleasure. you're not identified with the fluctuations of the mind stuff, with the fluctuations of emotions, with the fluctuations that happen in the physical world or in your physical body. Rather, you are non-attached. So, Buddhic non-attachment is part of the self or selfless levels. And when you reside within the Buddhic plane, you are non-attached, you have mentally wise action, emotionally love, and physically the capacity to work within groups in a loving, wise, and responsive way. And there's our bridge. Bailey goes on to talk about the mind as having 5 modifications, and here she relates them to the 5 senses. Again, read these commentaries and these books on your own. I don't have time to talk about all of this. These videos are probably way too long as they are. She says as well, mind is the 5th principle, and we need to learn to distinguish different levels of mind, including lower concrete mind and abstract mind. And in time, we get into Buddhic consciousness and Mahat or universal mind. But this only happens when we non-attach from the lower and attach to the higher, more macrocosmic principles. So here we go with some distinctions with our levels of consciousness again. So in the Bailey books, each of these levels, the physical, emotional, mental, Buddhic, Atmic plane, has other levels within it, sub-levels, so to speak, subplanes, she calls them. And in the mental plane, we have higher mind, abstract mind, lower mind, concrete mind. So here we have 7 planes. We've taken out the mental plane in the 7 sections with the causal body soul, this whole plane, and it has now been split into 7 levels. And within that, you see this like flower-like thing, which she calls the egoic lotus, the causal body. This is the soul. And it unfolds like a petal. In Christian mysticism, they use a rose. In Eastern mysticism, they use a lotus. But this idea of a flower unfolding its petals on the mental plane. And the lower planes are concrete mind. If you see the words lower mind, concrete mind, you see 1, 2, 3 planes there. The 4th plane with the arrow, let's forget about those symbols for right now. They're actually related to chakras, those of you that are familiar with that. And let's look at the 3 higher planes, higher mind, abstract mind, where the egoic lotus resides. Now, all of these levels are part of Mahat. The ego levels are also known as Prakriti. The levels of the self are known as Purusa. And this is really important because as you go through the Yoga Sutras of Pantanjali, you're going to hear Purusa and Prakriti over and over again. So now let's get clear what they are. Okay? Now also in the commentaries by Iyengar, he is introducing a lot of extra words here. And instead of the 5 senses, he's introducing the 5 elements. And all of this can become very detailed and very overwhelming, and you may feel it's all very picky to the essential points. But if you want to learn them now, it's actually really helpful as you go through the Bailey and the B.K.S. Iyengar commentaries especially. So Iyengar, let's just read them quickly, has the Atmic plane as the blissful Anandamaya levels related to ether. The Buddhic plane he regards as the intellectual, the Vijnanamaya related to air. And a quick commentary, because Buddhic intellectual, we're going to talk more about that later, is quite different than the higher abstract mind that Bailey is talking about in the previous slide. Then the mental is the Manomaya, related to fire in Iyengar's book. The emotional is related to water and also has a physiological pranayama component to it. And sometimes the emotional body is known as the vital body, and pranayama helps redirect those vital airs. It can become confusing because sometimes the vital body is related to something known as the etheric body. And so we're getting into the picky stuff, but it's good to start to wrap your mind around the concepts. It'll help you with the commentaries as we proceed. And the physical has to do with the anatomical, or the Annamaya, and was related to earth. So the main thing in this slide is just get the understanding of Mahat is related to them all. And especially remember that the self is going to be Purusa, peaceful self, Purusa, and the ego is related to Prakriti. So the meditation that goes with this sutra is called Painful versus Painless Mind States. And you are encouraged to find the separate video and follow this meditation on a regular basis, ideally for 1 week, to help you embody your understanding of the sutra. If you've already seen this part, because you're going through the videos together, you can stop here. If you're brand new and have jumped into this video, remember that as you work through the Yoga Sutras of Pantanjali, I recommend that you obtain copies of the 3 books so you can get your own impressions and a more complete understanding of what each author has to say in each sutra. Try to work with only 1 sutra a week. I know it's a long process, but remember the point is to practice, not just study. Follow the meditations for each sutra many times during the week. And if you're taking the course with me, you're welcome to share your questions, comments, and experiences. I will answer as best I can, and information about me and how to work with me follows. Namaste.